name is Achim Steiner. I head the United Nations Development Program, the UN's development organization, active in 170 countries, 17,000 staff, and approximately $5 billion in annual revenue to spend on development challenges around the world. Well, I was born in Brazil, so my life started in a developing country. My parents were farmers, and as I grew up, I was determined to spend my life in some form of international profession. And I then chose to follow a course that was fairly broad. It was a course in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then specialized in development economics, because to me that was a field that was both fascinating, and the idea that you could work in many different cultures and countries, and yet at the same time be engaged in something that would address issues that clearly are of concern to all of us, but also require a form of public service that perhaps is not that easy to find. And so my career really began as a development economist, initially in rural development in Pakistan, and then I continued to move more and more into the field of sustainable development, and by some coincidence and serendipity, increasingly also focusing on the issue of environment, of sustainability, because to me, in the 80s and 90s, it was quite clear that that was going to be the challenge of the 21st century, how to allow 5, 6, 7 billion people to live together on this planet and not destroy it in the course of doing so. And one thing led to the next, and I found myself then working for the International Union of Conservation of Nature. And from there on, one post, one opportunity followed another. And that really is the journey that led me into this field of work, and today to leading the Sustainable Development Organization of the United Nations. Well, when the Secretary General invited me to lead UNDP in 2017, I arrived at a moment in time where much of what we call development aid and development cooperation seemed to be in a phase where people had doubts, where also large organizations, and particularly United Nations organizations, were often seen as slow, as being more reflective of inertia and bureaucracy, rather than being on the cutting edge of trying to help countries think about what choices they have and also how to create options and opportunities. My challenge in 2017 was to join a team of 17,000 people distributed across 170 countries, working in extremely different contexts, from countries such as Yemen in the middle of a conflict to countries such as Malaysia, but also partners such as Singapore, Brazil, South Africa, China, and just to mention the broad range within which the development mandate of UNDP needed to find an expression to define both its relevance and its value into the future. And my ambition was to try and understand how the future of development cooperation would look like, and to make UNDP one of the key drivers of redefining that space of international cooperation, which also goes to the core of the role of the United Nations, how nations work with one another, partner with one another. Now, obviously, when you arrive in an institution like this, the temptation often is to come with preset ideas. And I think one thing that has guided me time and again as I took on different roles in my life is that the best thing you can do in the first year is to listen, is to look and to learn, because inside an organization is often enormous amount of talent, experience, but it is trapped. And trying to understand how you can liberate that talent, that energy, and that momentum is clearly key to a CEO being able to play his or her role. Now in UNDP, clearly trying to understand how we think about the future of development is a very ambitious way of framing it, but nothing less would do, because it is the United Nations Development Program. And we had to find a way in which to both interpret an uncertain and unclear but a rapidly changing future in a global context, but also to understand how to evolve an institution's offering. And after having traveled for about a year, or it was 8 to 9 months, and having listened to many of our staff who are working in the field, it became quite clear to me that for most of them, trying to just implement the routine work of UNDP took up all their time. Yet many of them are in fact innovators. That's the job of a development advisor. And yet the very thing that they were there for, they almost had no time, because implementation, project management, reporting, and all these things prevented them from being able to spend time in terms of looking around, because development is as much about bringing something as it is to discover something within the countries and communities we work. So out of that grew this notion that innovation, not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, to transform an organization's way of working, to transform what it is that we could contribute to the challenge of governments, but also of communities and societies as a whole, would be a driver for discovery. And this is where the idea of the Accelerator Labs was born, because it was also the time of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, just over a decade to try and meet some of the most ambitious goals ever defined by countries for development on the planet. And the idea was then, in a sense, nurtured around this notion that innovation can be a driver, it can be a catalyst, but it must be embedded in an organization. And in order to transform an organization as large as UNDP, it needed to be bold, it needed to be big, and it needed to be systemic. And so out of that came my proposal at the time to establish 60 accelerator labs simultaneously attached and embedded in 60 country offices, both as a way of creating a horizontal network or an ecosystem of innovation within the organization, but also as a resource to all our staff who could now draw on these talents that we would bring new and fresh into the organization to change their own work. Many advisors against it. The idea that you would set up 60 labs in just a few months was considered to be, well, at best overambitious and naive, and perhaps to some even risky. But we found partners. We learned from some of the best think tanks and innovation centers around the world. They were fascinated by the idea. They joined us. They helped us to shape it. And we found an amazing team who would actually begin to curate this project and engage with finding the talent that we would then bring into the organization. And in less than 6 months, we advertised the positions, 180 positions around the world. We had 8,000 applicants. We created new job descriptions never heard of before in the United Nations, head of exploration, head of experimentation, and so on. And we attracted many people, including a third of those who were finally appointed being people who were living abroad and wanted to come back to their countries, because part of the idea was also, let's bring in people from the startup scene, from the technology world, from the entrepreneurial world and science, talents that were not normally in a career path of the UN, people who would find their way into the UN easily. Out of that, we are now 1.5 years into the project. The MIT Review on Management recently published an article and actually highlighted how the accelerator labs had become an example of how to build a network of ecosystems for innovation. Our country teams are embracing them, and the experiment has been so successful in terms of creating opportunity and creating energy and momentum that we are actually increasing the labs to 90 countries by the end of this year. And both in terms of the development focus, identifying new ways of working, learning and working with other partners we normally would not have reached out to, and also transforming UNDP's own thinking, self-confidence, and the way that we are planning our work for the future clearly has had a major impact. So it's a good example that demonstrates both an antidote to the cliche of an organization cannot change, large organizations are slow. Yes, they are, but they can change, and you have to find the right way to both motivate, inspire, and then enable and empower people, liberate them, as I often say, in our country teams to do the things that they know they would like to do, but we're not able to do. And so here we are in the year 2020, even in the midst of a pandemic, we are just about to expand, as I said, to 90 labs in 90 countries. Well, whenever you're trying to bring change or even bring a new idea into a community, be it employees, be it a school community or an office, two things I think are critical. One is you have to create trust and confidence in you as a proponent of that idea. It means you have to do your homework, you have to listen, you have to understand the subject. Don't be clever about it. Try and first of all understand why people are acting the way they do and what would enable them to act differently. And secondly, I think leadership is also about motivation, it is about inspiration, and it is sometimes about having the courage to take decisions because you're in a position to take those decisions that many others aren't. And these leadership qualities, I think, are critical to creating, first of all, the setting within which to experiment. And secondly, I think that is also the moment where you have to make bets. And sometimes bets will go wrong. Taking risks in management, in leadership is basically something you have to do every day. And you have to live with the fact that sometimes you will make perhaps the wrong judgment. But that's not a tragedy as long as you are able to bring people with you, allow them to understand why you're doing something. And I think at the end of the day, in all of us, there is this yearning for being able to make a difference. So if you create opportunity, people will rise to this challenge. And I think sometimes you will also have to accept that certain things that you think should happen, maybe the institution is not yet ready. Maybe you're overstretching the capacity of people to respond. So in my 3 years now as leading UNDP, there are a number of transformational initiatives where essentially I've had to take the foot off the pedal because I could see that the institution could not sustain them right now. They were still the right thing to do, but maybe you have to postpone it or you have to re-engineer the approach. Management is as much about a kind of scientific approach to, identifying problems, planning solutions, looking at implementation, as it is in the art of recognizing the psyche of an organization, and ultimately also to appeal a little bit to its soul. Not that institutions have souls, but the people within them represent the soul of an organization. And I think aspiration, coupled with purpose, coupled with values, put together in something that puts us as staff members of UNDP in this extraordinary position where we're able to both work in fields that we believe in, we are passionate about, we studied, and we spent years acquiring the skills, and at the same time contributing to the well-being of so many others is an extraordinary capital with which to work. And I think that is what fascinates me about the task of leading an organization as big and as globally distributed as UNDP is. Embedded, by the way, in the United Nations with its extraordinary purpose and history also in terms of when it was born and how it struggles to deliver in a world that is yet again becoming more divided and polarized. That's a very interesting question, and I draw on my personal experience many years ago, and it was the era of Jim Wolfenson leading the World Bank when he essentially put 400 of his senior managers through an executive leadership program, taking some of the best business schools around the world to design specifically for the World Bank an executive leadership program. And these were business schools, but trying to bring the lessons of management into the public policy and public institutions arena, and a few outsiders were invited. I was lucky to be one of them. And I must say, for me, it was an eye-opening experience because here I was in Harvard and, it was 3 or 4 other business schools that were there, working with case studies from business in terms of leadership, management, strategy. And, it was very revealing because, in fact, if you take away a few of the contextual elements, yes, there are shareholders, we have member states, there is the issue of revenue, profits, and costs. But if you take away from profit as an overarching criterion that often dominates discussions in the private sector, much of what we do in a public institution like UNDP is actually not that different in terms of management, strategy, results-based investments and reporting than it is in business. So I learned a lot also from, let's say, the science of management as practiced in the private sector, not because it is entirely different from a public institution, but precisely because the fundamental variables of managing an institution, managing people, managing resources is actually not that different. And secondly, in an equal sense, important is to realize that government is actually quite often very entrepreneurial. Professor Mazzucato, who may be known to some of you, is somebody who has brought back some attention also on the role of the state, of government institutions as being catalysts for innovation, entrepreneurial drivers, the internet, a man on the moon. I mean, all these examples abound when you think back in history. And I think I see very much my role at this moment in time in leading the UN's development program in precisely enabling this institution to be a partner to government, to allow governments to either rediscover or to refine and perfect their role as entrepreneurial states, which is not to dominate an economy, but to understand that the development equation of the future is not the state will solve the problem or leave it to the market. It is in smart public policy. It is in a different ethic in the private sector and the markets that looks at their purpose also, not just the product, not just the market share, not just the turnover, but also a degree of public purpose. And this is where the Sustainable Development Goals are in so many ways a powerful magnet. They allow us to recognize the great risks of the 21st century, the goals that we have defined in order to minimize those risks and achieve better development outcomes, and they are an open invitation for government, but for the private sector, for citizens, for non-governmental organizations to work in partnership in achieving those. So I think these are a few aspects that I would bring to this discussion, whether it is a private sector perspective or a public sector perspective. Ultimately, we are managing people, and managing people is not fundamentally different whether you're in a public institution or a private one. The incentives, the motivators sometimes have been very different, or they have been portrayed as being very different. Maybe we need to rediscover a little bit about what works with human nature. You know, in establishing UNDP's accelerator labs, there are those things that you are looking in terms of immediate results. Is it bringing innovation? Is it creating new approaches, new solutions, new partnerships? But then there is a second tier of benefits also that have to do more with the intangibles of, for example, attracting 180 unusual people to come and join UNDP. They're often people who would not have thought of themselves as ever working for the United Nations. They are social entrepreneurs, they are scientists, they are data specialists, they are inventors and creative people. And that experience, I think, is going to be a very interesting one to observe, because these people are now part of our community. They are beginning to change the way our teams think and work and approach issues. And in return, they're also becoming themselves development professionals, because it's not just, you know, having knowledge. You also need to understand how, in a development cooperation context, your knowledge, your skills, your contribution can be best brought into a political, economic, and social reality, perhaps in a country that has many challenging issues to face. I also look at one particular experience that we had not even envisaged, and that is, in UNDP today, in the 21st century, in the digital age, we have to find a way in which we connect the expertise of our 17,000 staff around the world in a far more agile way, using digital connectivity, but also the ability to bring people to respond to, perhaps on the other side of the world, to a question about how could this be done? Is there a best practice somewhere? One thing that was very interesting, when we employed these 180 new staff members, we put them through a boot camp. They came together, they spent a week together, we trained them in some common and shared methodologies that we would like the labs to propose and to develop. And we also found suddenly that we had created a global policy network, because out of this boot camp, all of them established a WhatsApp group. Suddenly we had in 60 countries a horizontal network of innovation communicating across the entire globe. And that was a fascinating discovery. And I think ultimately UNDP will, over the next few years, experience interesting boost in, first of all, new talent and new capacities coming to the organization, and also learning through perhaps unanticipated ways how you can overcome silos, how you can connect in this modern digital world expertise, innovation, experimentation, and making UNDP that which I believe it should be, the great connector of cutting-edge thinking, practice, and choices that we can help governments make in their daily work. It's never down to one skill, but I think perhaps the biggest skill that you need in order to learn and make yourself competent is something I alluded to earlier. You have to listen, and you have to listen with interest and also with an open mind, because, you know, we all come with our own baggage. We all have our prejudices, our determined and predetermined views. And yet, when you enter a social organism like an institution or a corporation, there are so many more people who know so much more about the history of the organization, what works, what doesn't work. I think listening is literally the biggest skill you can have. Obviously, if you simply listen, it's a passive activity. The next best thing that you have to bring to the table is the ability to synthesize, to analyze, and to also identify what are the key variables with which you can work. And I think therein lies then the opportunity of making choices, of placing bets, of issuing, if you want, a challenge to your team in how to think about an area that you want to tackle. And frankly, I think often people say, well, you know, do it in bite-sized chunks. I don't agree, particularly when it comes to public policy. They are often intractable problems: inequality, poverty, sexual discrimination. So many of the issues we're dealing with, they are embedded in the complexity of our society, and the role of public institutions in many ways are a reflection of that complexity. So don't try to look for the oversimplified answer. Embrace complexity. Look also towards a systems approach to management. I think if there's one thing that I would say in our field of development cooperation, basically the choices that our societies make about the future, we are living in the 21st century. Things simply are a lot more complicated when you have to live with 7 billion people on a planet with many finite resources, where the sustainability variable of development is increasingly challenged. We have to reinvent our economies. We have to bring people with us in terms of making different choices and setting different priorities. We have to even reinvent economic paradigms. Nothing less is the task. And I would say, if you're intimidated by that, you lose an opportunity to be able to, first of all, recognize the actual possibilities for change. And secondly, you tend to underestimate what an institution with a clear purpose and a clear way of thinking about solutions can actually accomplish, because we're often catalysts. And I think this is an important concept to bear in mind. Nothing is ever done by one person, nothing's ever done by one mega corporation, nor by government on its own. We are all catalysts, and I think that is part of understanding how you can affect change.